Wednesday night study through First Samuel. And this evening we're going to be in First Samuel chapter 21 as we continue the path of David. Last week we left him off where he was beginning his wilderness journeys, and now we begin to see just where David is. And so as David's walking through, you see where he has a forsaking of his fear the forsaking of his faith because of the fear that he's been going through, and just the fear of Saul and fleeing. So again, let's just bow our hearts and then we'll look at the word. Father, we're so grateful for just this passage. We're so grateful for who you are and how you work in our hearts. And Lord, as we see these failures in the life of David, Father, we recognize that we too are but flesh. We too have weaknesses and we too have fears, and so often we can allow those fears to overcome, and our faith is forsaken, and we no longer trust in you, but we seek to do what we can in our own wisdom and our own understanding. And so we do ask, Lord, that through your Spirit, through your word, that you would grant us, Lord, your children, just that ability to recognize when fear is winning, when we're going back to our own flesh and our own understanding, and rather than trusting in you and your word, and just leaning on you and believing in you, and truly, Lord, letting you bring about what victories you need to bring about. So we ask that you would illuminate our hearts and our minds to yours. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. So through this, if you would open your Bibles to 1 Samuel chapter 21, as we begin this. And as we look to this initially, let's just look through this passage and see where it is that God has a word for us. It begins this in verse 1 of 1 Samuel 21. Now David came to Nob, to Ahimelech, the priest. And Ahimelech was afraid when he met David and said to him, "Why are you alone? And no one is with you." So David said to Ahimelech the priest, "The king has ordered me on some business, and said to me, 'Do not let anyone know anything about the business on which I send you, or what I have commanded you. And I have directed my young men to such and such a place. Now therefore, what have you on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread in my hand, or whatever can be found." And the priest answered David and said that there is no common bread on hand, but there is holy bread, if the young men have at least kept themselves from women. And David answered the priest and said to him, "Truly, women have been kept from us about 3 days since I came out, and the vessels of the young men are holy, and the bread is in effect common, even though it was consecrated in the vessel this day." So the priest gave him the holy bread, for there was no bread there but the showbread, which had been taken from before the Lord, in order to put hot bread in its place on the day when it was taken away. At this point, we look to what's happening here with David, and we begin to see that initially that David comes to this place called Nob, and David came to Nob, to Ahimelech, the priest. As he comes to Nob, keep in mind that we know, just with the maps and everything, the Nob is about 2 miles to the east and to the west of Jerusalem. And where David was just prior in chapter 20, remember back in verse 42, it simply opened up. So at the very end of that passage, where it makes the statement, where it says, "May the Lord be between you and me, and between your descendants and my descendants forever." So he arose and departed, and Jonathan went into the city. We see that David himself, he departs and he goes into the wilderness. Jonathan, he goes back to Gibeah. And Gibeah itself, according to the map, if you just punch up Google Maps, is about 3.7 miles away from Jerusalem. So keep in mind that David has traveled about 2 miles to the south of where he was in Gibeah. And as he was there in Gibeah, now he has another 2 miles to go. If he goes to the south and to the east, he goes to Jerusalem. So he's only traveled about 2 miles before he came to Nob. And as he comes to the Nob, recognize that there's a passage in 2 Samuel chapter 22. And in verse 19, it says, also Nob, the city of the priest, he struck with the edge of the sword, both men and women. So as Doeg goes and he wipes out the city of Nob for giving David the showbread, and he gives him the sword of Goliath, as we're about to see, that it talks about Nob and it calls Nob the city of priests. So the priests themselves, they serve in the temple, but they have a residence where many of the priests actually stay in Nob. So it was just simply called the city of the priest. And David, in the chapters previously, back in chapter 19, remember when he had that issue with Saul, he went to Samuel. And Samuel was there with the prophets and they were prophesying. Well, David doesn't go back to Samuel and doesn't tell Samuel the issue. This time he goes to the priest. He goes to Ahimelech. And as he goes to the priest, he simply comes to him. And the priest is a little bit nervous as David comes. And so David is by himself. He's in haste. Keep in mind that he's already been hiding out in the wilderness for about 3 days, waiting on Jonathan to come back with news about where Saul is. And, David has been crying, he's been weeping. And so David doesn't look, great in what he is. He's been 3 days without a shower. He's been crying. He's just kind of a hot mess. But yet at this point, he comes to Ahimelech. And as Ahimelech sees him, he's a little bit afraid. He's trying to figure out what it is that's going on. And so it's interesting that where David is at this point is he begins to take the situation into his own hands. He begins to use his own wisdom. He begins to say, what do I see? What do I know? And what can I do? And so through this area, what David does is he comes now to Nob as he's traveling south. He's about 2 miles away from the journey where he started. As he comes, he now sees the priest. And as he comes to the priest, David asks Ahimelech, and so he says, as Ahimelech is kind of worried about what's going on, says, why are you alone? And no one is with you. So David had been a captain of armies, and so he anticipated David being with people. At this point, David's alone. He's looking kind of ragged. And as David comes to this place, what David does is this, very uniquely, that he isn't leaving this situation that he's in God's hand. Initially, he went to Samuel. God just took care of it. He humbled Saul. He made Saul strip himself of his kingly garments. And he also made Saul just sit down and worship the Lord. So he did that for a day and night as he was laying prostrate before God. And David was able to leave. David was able to, not be killed. Saul had gone there to kill him. So through this area, I want you to see what begins to happen is when David comes and the priest asks him simply why he's alone, rather than being open, rather than being honest, David, he lies. And it's interesting that what begins to happen is through these lies, he's trying to take the situation. He's trying to figure out what he can do. He's trying to do it in his own strength. He's trying to do it in his own power. And he's not looking to the Lord. He's looking to him, and he's looking to men and godly men. I mean, as he goes to Ahimelech. But keep in mind that this is not the first time where the children of Israel have sort of taken what's going on and put it into their own hands, trying to figure out what's going on. If you remember all the way back in 1 Samuel chapter 4, where the children of Israel were going against the Philistines, and as the Philistines were having their way with them, eventually what happens is this, that the elders in 1 Samuel chapter 4, beginning in verse 3, make this statement. So the elder said, why has the Lord defeated us this day before the Philistines? Let us bring the ark of the covenant of the Lord to Shiloh to us, that when it comes among us, it may save us from the hand of our enemies. And so we see that there is this understanding where the children of Israel recognize, let's put it into our own hands. Let's do what we do. Let's just get the ark and let's come here and let's understand what we can do as far as our own victory so we know what to do. Let's bring the ark. Let's take care of it. Well, there's also that passage in 1 Samuel chapter 13. And in 1 Samuel chapter 13, we make note of it where all of a sudden, Saul himself comes to the point where he's trying to figure out what's going on. And so what happens is this. It makes this statement about Saul when he had waited 7 days, according to the time set by Samuel. But Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and the people were scattered from him. And so Saul said, "Bring a burnt offering and a peace offering here to me." And he offered that burnt offering. And it says, now it happened as soon as he had finished presenting the burnt offering that Samuel came, and Saul went out to meet him that he might greet him. And so Saul goes out to meet Samuel, and Samuel said, "What have you done?" And Saul said, "When I saw that the people were scattered from me, and that you did not come within the days appointed, and the Philistines gathered together at Michmash, and I said, the Philistines will now come down on me at Gilgal, and I have not made supplication for the Lord. Therefore I felt compelled and offered a burnt offering." And then Samuel says to Saul, "You have done foolishly." Within this point, we see here that there are multiple times where people begin to have faith, and all of a sudden their faith wavers. Their faith wavers to think, hey, I know what I can do, and I can handle this on my own. I don't have to rely on God. I can simply do this on my own. And so there's many opportunities that we see in the scriptures of just having that understanding in our own hearts, that people begin to walk, and then all of a sudden they begin to stumble. If you remember that passage, and this is an incredible one where faith meets fear, and then fear meets faith again. And this is where here in Matthew chapter 14, where Jesus comes to the disciples and he's walking on the water. And eventually what happens is this, is as he's walking on the water, verse 27, verse 26 is when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were troubled, saying, "It is a ghost," and they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke, and he says, "Be of good cheer, it is I, do not be afraid." And Peter answered him and said, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." And so he said, "Come." And when Peter had come down out of the boat, he walked on the water to go to Jesus. But it says this in verse 30. When he saw that the wind was boisterous, he was afraid. And beginning to sink, he cried out, saying, "Lord, save me." And immediately Jesus stretched out his hand, caught him, and said to him, "O you little faith, why did you doubt?" So it's interesting that what we see is that Peter here has that same situation where immediately he has faith. Everyone was afraid, and when he saw Jesus, and Jesus says, don't be afraid, then Peter says, "Okay, fine, we won't be afraid. Lord, if it's you, just command me to come out and command me to come to you." So Jesus said, "Come." But when he saw the wind, he saw the waves, and he saw that they were contrary, that they were more than what he thought he could handle, he became afraid. And in that fear, it took him away from faith, the faith of being able to walk to Jesus. And now it was the fear of, oh no, I can't walk because of the situation. I can't rely on Jesus because this is now the focal point of my attention. And as he has that fear, and it begins to, and the faith is forsaken, then all of a sudden we begin to see how Peter sinks. And then he has faith once again. The faith is quick. The faith is powerful, but he simply says, "Lord, save me." And then Jesus reaches in his hand, he takes him and pulls him from the boat. So understand that where faith versus fear, it's not an unusual thing. And there are times where faith wins out and there is no fear. And there's times where fear is going to win out and the faith struggles. The interesting thing is that sometimes when faith struggles, that you don't have to stay there. And this is the blessing. This is what we're going to see, not necessarily in this chapter, but as we get into the next chapter, the event that took place between chapter 21 and chapter 22. And we'll be looking at that as we start next week. But I do want you to see that here, immediately what happens with David is that he comes to this point and he is fearful. He's sad. He's not knowing what's going on, and so there's a lot of questions in his mind. There's a lot of doubt, and he's running from Saul. He's running for his life. And he just left Jonathan. He travels a couple miles and he finds himself in Nob. And as he's there in Nob, Ahimelech kind of has this concern to say, hey, what's going on? Why are you alone? And uniquely what happens is this, that David lies. David lies. And there's multiple lies that he does. I do want to share with you a passage. If you're a note taker, jot it down in your Bible, that you can have this reference as you begin to read through these passages again and again. But very uniquely in 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 19, it makes this declaration. Therefore, let those who suffer according to the will of God commit their souls to him in doing good as to a faithful creator. And it talks about suffering. It talks about suffering according to the will of God. And it says, let those who suffer according to the will of God. And I love the fact he says, commit their souls to him. You commit your souls to him, and basically in doing good, you simply say, I'm going to do the right thing. And because God, you've been faithful and I want to be faithful to you. So through the situations that, although we do have those times where it is a struggle and we don't know what's going on, the important thing is stay faithful, stay true to what you know to be true. And David doesn't. He, in his fear, he begins to now is concerned that here Ahimelech is afraid. So he's trying to calm him, but he can't calm him with the truth. So he's going to simply calm him with lies. And this is what David does. So in verse 2, David said to Ahimelech the priest, the king has ordered me on some business. So David not only lies about his situation, but he also puts words into King's mouth, into the King Saul's mouth, because he said, the king has ordered me on some business. And he said to me, do not let anyone know anything about the business on which I send you or what I have commanded you. And I have directed my young men to such and such a place. And so as we see here, what David does is this, that David begins to lie. Not only does he lie about why he's there, but he puts words into the king's mouth. Now, David's lies are confusing because initially what happens is when Ahimelech looks to him, he says, why are you alone? And as David goes on, it's really interesting because there in verse 2, David initially makes the statement, the king ordered me on some business, and he said to me. And so David makes this statement. He says, well, the king sent me, and here I am. And as I'm going through this, and then he said, and I have directed my young men to such and such a place. So initially David said, yes, I was alone. And now he says, I'm not alone. And he goes on in his lies, and it's kind of confusing to see what begins to happen, because there in verse 5, David makes this statement. Then David answered the priest and said to him, truly women have been kept from us, plural. David's not alone, for about 3 days since I came out. Now he talks about singular again. So it's not since we came out, but it's I came out. And the vessels of the young men, again, you're talking about the plurality, that he's not alone. And so he says the vessels of the young men are holy. So David in his lies, he does something absolutely amazing, that his lies are about the situation, and he puts words into the king's mouth, and they're confusing. He's first he's alone, and then he's with others, and then he's with others, and then he's alone. And so it's interesting that when David lies, he's not a good one. He's not a good liar. And may that ever be so with a Christian, that we become so horrible at lying that we just simply give it up. And it's just an interesting thing that is David there? Is he alone? Is he not? And so, but not only does he claim to be alone and then with people, but he also now says the king has sent me on some business. And when the king sends me on business, it was to make haste. And so I find that interesting, that as David begins to go through this, he makes that statement. And so as he looks to this, and as he speaks to him, but he says, just so interesting, the king has ordered me on some business. And he said, do not let anyone know the business which I command you. And I've directed my young men to such and such a place. And he says, now therefore, verse 3, he says, give me 5 loaves of bread in my hand, or whatever can be found. And so the priest answered David in verse 4 and said, there is no common bread on hand, but there is holy bread, if the young men have at least kept themselves from women. And so he now says, okay, David, you have men, and so you're needing 5 loaves of bread. And so David is looking for bread not only for right now, but he's looking for it down the road because he's fleeing. He doesn't know what's about to happen. And so as he's there with Ahimelech, he tries to do as much as he can to provide for not only his now, but he tries to provide for his future as well. Well, as he does so, he makes this statement in verse 5 that David answered the priest and said to him, truly women have been kept from us about 3 days. And the vessels of the young men are holy, and the bread is in effect common, even though it was consecrated this day. And so it's just interesting to see that David here begins to really try to focus on what's going on. And so when he does come to this, he says, listen, the king has ordered me there in haste. And so I don't have a whole lot of time to prepare the things that I needed. And so with this, it's just an interesting point as David begins to go through this situation. And so when David comes to this point, not only is he confused about the situation with his food and why he doesn't have it, and why he had to flee right away or leave the king right away, but he wasn't able to have bread. He wasn't able to have a weapon. And so where in verse 8 of 1 Samuel 21, David does make that statement. David said to Ahimelech, is there not here on hand a spear or a sword? For I have brought neither my sword nor my weapons with me, because the king's business required haste. So it's interesting that David had left so quickly that he couldn't bring food, he couldn't bring a weapon, but yet at the same time he could gather young men. And so it doesn't take long to grab a loaf of bread. It doesn't take long to strap on a sword. But he could say that I've gathered men, and I didn't have time to get food, and I didn't have time to strap on a sword. So apparently all the men that he gathered were right there with him, and they all left instantly, and none of them had weapons, none of them had food. So you begin to see how just David's lies are just catching up with him, where he's trying to make a point, but his point is being blurred by facts. And so it sounds good, it works good. And so as we look to this, I do want you to see that as David comes to this point in getting the showbread, getting the showbread is a powerful, powerful passage. What happens is there was a point in Jesus's ministry that he actually alludes to this situation, to this event that David was in. And within the situation, there is a passage in Matthew chapter 12. In verses 1 through 8, it says, at the time Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and his disciples were hungry and began to pluck the heads of grain to eat. And when the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath. But he said to them, have you not read what David did when he was hungry, and he and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God and ate the showbread, which was not lawful for him to eat, nor for those who were with him, but only for the priest? Or have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath the priest in the temple profane the Sabbath? In other words, they do work on the Sabbath, and he says, and are blameless. Yet I say to you, in this place there is one greater than the temple. But if you had known what it means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would have not condemned the guiltless, for the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. And as we see here that the religious leaders were really beginning to belittle Jesus's disciples as they went on the grain field. And so what's happening is this: they were saying that they were eating with unclean hands. It didn't mean they were dirty physically, but they were dirty ceremonially. So within the ceremony of cleansing your hands ceremonially, that there is a washing from the elbows on down and then from the fingers on up. And so you have to cleanse everything, and then you are ceremonially clean. And so they're worried about their traditions. They're worried about everything else. And so they're blaming the disciples, not because they're breaking the law, but because they're breaking their traditions. And so Jesus clarifies. So what happens is this is the showbread Um, it wasn't ordered specifically that only the Levites could eat it, but that the Levites should eat it. And it was bread that was sanctified over to the Lord. And that as it was given to the Lord, that we begin to see that God says, this is mine. And so this is my representative of the children of Israel, and it's before me, so it's consecrated. So it can't be regarded as something that's holy. So whenever something was given over to God, it should be considered holy. And so what David does is he says, okay, here I am. And of course, I have men with me, and we're all going to partake of this bread. And so that's as much as Ahimelech knows. And so the priest simply says, well, it's consecrated bread. You guys got to at least have consecrated yourselves, and so you can't have given yourselves over to things carnally. And David lets him know, yeah, we're good with that. We have done that. And of course, David, he hasn't been with anybody for 3 days. He's been hiding out in the woods waiting for Jonathan. And so through that, we look to this and we see that here David gets the showbread. And so beautifully the Lord provides. And not only does he provide for the sustenance, it's just a great lesson for us to know that God always takes the human needs are more important than the physical aspects of just simply doing the traditions of men and trying to say, well, this is what the law says. And so keep in mind that when you have a human need, that a lot of times God will say, hey, that trumps everything. Take care of your brother, minister to them, be that good Samaritan, and seek to minister as you can. So through this, we see that David comes to this point, and as he's been there in the waiting on Jonathan, he hasn't gone to the feast back in the last chapter. At this point, we see that here David is hungry. He comes to Nob, he comes to Ahimelech, and he asks for bread. And of course, God provides for him. And I love the fact that even though David isn't honest, that David is lying, that God still simply says, listen, you're doing it all the wrong way, but I'm still good. Even though you're not, I'm still a provider and I'm still a good God, and I still love you and I have a plan for you. And keep in mind that this lack of faith is going to be a temporary thing, as we're going to see at the beginning of the next chapter. But as he goes into this downfall, as he goes into this place of forsaking his faith, because the fear simply overwhelms him. As the fear does so, God simply says, do not be afraid. Well, why does he say do not be afraid? The reason he says do not be afraid is because many times we're afraid, and the fear begins to conquer us. The fear begins to go above us. And so beautifully, God constantly says, I know your weaknesses. I know you are flesh. You're but dust, but don't worry. My grace, where sin abounds and where your weakness abounds, that my grace will abound even more. And so it isn't that we stay in that place, but we will find ourselves in that place. And so it isn't about going into sin and staying in that sin and practicing sin, but it is an understanding that we are weak and sometimes we'll fall into those areas of sin. So when that happened, it was just this beautiful understanding of this passage where David here receives this bread. Well, after he receives the bread, then we begin to see almost a parenthesis. There in verse 7, it makes a statement. Now, a certain man of the servants of Saul was there that day. So whatever reason, he was there in Nob, and he was detained before the Lord. And his name was Doeg, an Edomite, the chief of the herdsmen who belonged to Saul. Now, we see that this Doeg was there, and he had to, for some reason, go before the priest. He was detained before the Lord. There was something that he needed to do to either become ceremonially clean, or he needed to do something before the priest. We don't know what it was, but for whatever reason, he was delayed. So he was there in Nob, and he was waiting on whatever ministry would be done, whatever he needed the priest to do to him. So that it simply says that he was waiting on the Lord. But while he was there, Doeg sees this whole thing. Now, it's interesting that Doeg is an Edomite. Now, there's a passage that you should be aware of, actually found in Genesis chapter 36. 2 verses I want to read to you. And the first one is this. In Genesis chapter 36, beginning in verse 1, it says, this is the genealogy of Esau, who is Edom. And then it says this. There in verse 9, it says, and this is the genealogy of Esau, the father of the Edomites in Mount Seir. So we know that the Edomites are descendants from Esau. Esau, of course, is the twin brother of Jacob. And so you have Jacob and you have Esau. So in other words, the Edomites are family in a sense, like cousins, but they are family to the children of Israel. But the Edomites were an interesting group of people. And so what they did to Israel was something that God says, I'm going to judge you for. And eventually God is going to say through Balaam that, hey, listen, Israel's going to have Edom. But at this point, I want you to see that there's a passage in Numbers chapter 20, beginning in verse 14, says, now Moses sent messengers from Kadesh to the king of Edom. Thus says your brother Israel, we're descendants of the two twins. You know all the hardships that have befallen us and how our fathers went down to Egypt, and we dwelt in Egypt a long time, and the Egyptians afflicted us and our fathers. And we cried out to the Lord, and he heard the voice and sent the angel and brought us up out of Egypt. Now here we are in Kadesh, a city at the edge of your border. Please let us pass through your country. We will not pass through the fields or vineyards, nor will we drink water from wells. We will go along the king's highway. We will not turn aside to the right hand or to the left until we pass through your territory. Then Edom said to him, so in other words, we're going to go right on through. We're not going to go anywhere. We're not going to stop. We're going to eat your food. We're not going to drink your wells. So we're going to take nothing from you. All we want to do is pass through your territory. Well, at this point, there in verse 18, Edom said to him, you shall not pass through my land, lest I come out against you with the sword. So the children of Israel said to him, we will go by the highway. And if I or any livestock drink any of your water, then I'll pay for it. Please let me only pass through on foot, nothing more. And then he said, you shall not pass through. So Edom came out against them with many men and with a strong hand. Thus Edom refused to give Israel passage through his territory. So Israel turned away from him. And we see that here, that what Edom should have done is they should have been the good neighbor. Remember there, the Samaritan, the good Samaritan, that all these people, the priest, the Levite, they saw someone who was in need. And radically, when they saw the need, they didn't stop. They didn't help. They simply moved to the side of the road and they continued on. And the same thing with Edom when Israel was in need. They chose not to help. They chose to say simply, you can't come here. You can't, we're not going to help you out. We're going to reject you. Go on your way. And so through that, we begin to see that here, this is where Edom is. And Doeg is an Edomite. And we'll see that as an Edomite, he doesn't have a real understanding or a fear of the Lord. Now, he was there. He was detained before the Lord. And so some way or another, he was either becoming a proselyte, and so he was there, the chief of Saul's herdsmen. But at this point, we're going to see that when it comes to the next chapter, that Doeg doesn't have a fear of the Lord, because eventually when the word through Doeg comes to Saul, Saul recognizes what Ahimelech did, and then what Saul wants is, he said, I want these priests along with Ahimelech killed. And none of the people of Saul will do that. However, although the people who are with Saul won't do that, Doeg the Edomite chooses to do so. And then he takes and he kills everyone there at Nob with the edge of the sword. And amazingly, he kills not only men, but the women, but infant and the livestock. It was the same thing that he should have done earlier, but he chose not to. And so absolutely incredibly, where Saul refused the command of the Lord to wipe out a people, now he simply goes and chooses to wipe out the priests. And so it's just a unique, interesting point of reference where we see that here it refers to Doeg, the Edomite. And so he doesn't have a heart for the Lord. He doesn't have a fear of God. He doesn't have a fear of the priests. And so this is what we see begins to take place here in verse 7. So it gives you parentheses. And the parentheses is necessary because in the next chapter, we begin to see that Doeg has his information. He passes it on to Saul. So through this information, we now see that David is here. Doeg is there being delayed, and David sees Doeg, knows of him, and he also knows that there's maybe an issue with Doeg. And there in chapter 22, it actually makes a statement where in verse 22 of chapter 22, David said to Abiathar, I knew that day when Doeg the Edomite was there that he would surely tell Saul, and I've caused the death of all the persons of your father's house. And so within the destruction that we begin to see that here, so incredible that all of the priests begin to suffer. All the priests die, all the children die, all the livestock die. And yet Saul would not do that to Ahimelech when God says, you need to wipe out Ahimelech, you need to wipe out the Amalekites, you need to just take them out. And so with one, he's disobedient, another, he doesn't even get the word. So he fails to do that with the enemies of God, but he chooses to do that with those who are serving God. And so through that, we now move on to verse 8. And here in our text in 1 Samuel chapter 20, verse 8, it makes a statement where, or chapter 21, verse 8, it makes this statement. He says, and David said to Ahimelech, is there not here on hand a spear or a sword? For I have brought neither my sword nor my weapons with me, because the king's business required haste. So the priest said, the sword of Goliath, the Philistine, whom you killed in the valley of Elah, there it is, wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. If you will take that, take it, for there is no other except that one here. And David said, there is none like it, give it to me. And David arose and he fled that day from before Saul. At this point, what we see is David here, he now wants to say, okay, I need a physical weapon. I need something to protect myself. And so he asks Ahimelech the priest, he says, do you have weapons here in Nob? Do you have anything that I can, use to protect myself? Do you have anything I can use to defend, or, that I'm going to need protection somewhere? And so amazingly, what he does is he says, there is the sword of Goliath, and it's wrapped. He says it's the same sword that you'd taken from Goliath. And so remember that passage back in chapter 17 of 1 Samuel. I just want to read to you a couple of verses of just where this passage is, and it's just incredible to see what begins to happen through this passage is this. That in verse 45 and in verse 46, David said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword and a spear and a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defiled. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, for I will strike you and take your head from you, and this day I will give the carcasses of the camp of the Philistines to the birds of the air. At this point, we see that in chapter 17, that Goliath, his weapon is the sword, his weapon is the spear. Now, David does have a sling, David does have stones, but in all honesty, David's weapon was spiritual, and it wasn't carnal. And you think about this, when we're here in chapter 21, and Ahimelech says, here's a sword, the sword that belonged to Goliath. The question that I would have for you is twofold. Is one, what good did that sword of Goliath do for its owner there in chapter 17? And the answer is, it didn't do him any good. The next question is this: what good did the faith of David in his God, that God would deliver him and God would protect him, what good did that do for David? And of course, we see that it did everything it needed to do for David. And so as we look to this, I just think it's an important thing that here, what David seeks to do is he tries to grab this physical weapon, and he doesn't grab onto the spiritual weapon. And so the physical weapon, the sword is what he's holding on to. The spiritual weapon is the faith is what is forsaken at this time. And so as that faith is forsaken, we begin to see that here David grabs this physical weapon, but he doesn't take the spiritual weapon that he had. It was so powerful back in chapter 17. He takes the physical weapon back in chapter 17 that had no effect other than when David used it as an act of faith after the Philistine was dead, that he took off the giant's head with the giant's own sword. And so through this point, I just want you to see that here's David, and he takes this sword of Goliath, and he's now holding that. This is my weapon. This is my tool. And as he takes this weapon, he takes that tool. I want you to see what he does with it. As we continue on in this passage, it declares this in verse 10. Then David arose and fled that day from before Saul. And he went to Achish, the king of Gath. And the servants of Achish said to him, is this not David, the king of the land? Did they not sing of him to one another in dances, saying? And so they said, Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s. Now David took these words to heart and was very much afraid of Achish, the king of Gath. And so he changed his behavior before them and pretended madness in their hands, scratched on the doors of the gate, and he let saliva fall down on his beard. Then Achish said to his servants, look, you see the man is insane. Why have you brought him to me? Have I need of a madman that you have brought this fellow to play the madman in my presence? Shall this fellow come into my house? So absolutely amazing. What David does is this. Why he does it, we're not told. That he does it, we are told. And what David chooses to do is this, that David now takes the sword of Goliath. He takes those 5 loaves of bread, and immediately what he chooses to do is David arose. He fled that day from before Saul, and he went to Achish, the king of Gath. He goes now to one of the kings of the Philistines. As he goes to Achish, it's amazing that what David does is he's either thinking maybe no one there would recognize me. I look ragged, I look haggard, and so, but I also have the sword of the Philistine. So whether he was hiding it or it was open, but eventually they knew that it was David. Now, as David goes to the king of the Philistines, there's a passage that I want you to recognize. And I think it's important for you to grasp, because in Psalm 56, at the very beginning of Psalm 56, there's a header, there's a preface. And what the header says is this. Psalm 56, it says, to the chief musician set to silent dove in distant lands, a miktam of David when the Philistines captured him in Gath. So at this point, recognize that what David had done is David was there in Gath, and it makes that statement in Psalm 56 that David was captured. So they had literally said, you're not just a free man, you're not walking into our king, you're not walking before our king. And so literally they took him captive. And so David comes as a captive man, not a free man, there before the king. Now, as David is there before the king, all of a sudden David begins to be worried. David begins to have this fear. In Psalm 56, there's a couple of verses I want to read to you, because David makes this declaration. In verse 3, he says, whenever I am afraid, I will trust in you. And it's just a beautiful point. In verse 4, he says, in God, I will praise his word. In God, I have put my trust. I will not fear. What can flesh do to me? And so David at this point makes this beautiful statement when he's captured. And as he's captured, keep in mind that we're looking to what David is going through here. And as he's captured, he's making this understanding to say, yeah, whenever I'm afraid, I'm going to put my faith in God. And so when I'm afraid, I'm going to trust in you. And so he makes that statement. It's simply, I put my trust in you. And in verse 9, David makes this statement through Psalm 56. This is when I cry out to you, then my enemies will turn back. This I know because God is for me. The victory was because God was for me. And in verse 11, he says, in God I have put my trust. I will not be afraid. What can man do to me? How beautiful it is that David comes to this point when he's captured and he's there before the king of the Philistines. And as he's there before the king of Gath, whether he was just trying to be a guy around the city, whether he was trying to be a homeless guy around the city, eventually they recognized who he was. They brought him before the king, and they told the king, it's like, this is David. This is the guy who has basically, as they make a statement, is this not David, the king of the land, that they say in verse 11? It's an amazing thing that David knew that he was supposed to be king. The Philistines knew that he was supposed to be king. Samuel knew that he was supposed to be king. His brothers knew that he was supposed to be king. Saul and Jonathan both knew that he was supposed to be king, but Saul is refusing to let David take the role that God had given to him. For some reason, the Philistines attribute to David that he is the king. And so they say, isn't this the one who they sing about and dance about, where they said basically, Saul has slain his thousands, David his 10,000s. And so they recognize that the power of David, they recognize the killing of David, and how, listen, even in the songs, it says that this man, David, who is before you now, has killed 10,000s of the Philistines. And as we look to that, it's just a powerful understanding of where David, in verse 12, he took the words to heart and was very much afraid of Achish, the king of Gath. And so here he is, and he's now before the king. He's now a captive before the king. But as he's there, so beautifully, just God begins to wash over him. And it's one of those things where, as David is going through the situation, that we see here, so incredible that he pretends madness. And so it's almost as if, they're like, wow, why would this man come to me? Why would this man come before me? And so what David does is, it's a crazy thing. He's like, are you nuts to go before the king of the Philistines? You've had victory over them again and again, and you've taken, 200 of the foreskins of the Philistines for a dowry to your wife, to Michal, and all this stuff is going on. And yet David now pretends to be crazy. He scratches at the doorpost. He allows saliva to fall down onto his beard. And keep in mind that in that time, the beard was a thing of honor, and you don't desecrate it. And here David is not caring for it. He's just pretending to be nuts. And commentaries differ. That say, some say that as he learns not to be afraid, that he is before the king as a captive, that he recognizes, oh my goodness, it's through faith that he thinks I'm nuts coming here. I'm going to show him that I am nuts. And others say that this act of faith and understanding of it comes directly afterwards. And so as he's captured, he's before the king, and initially he's playing the madman. And then as he's doing so, then he recognizes, oh, this is, the king says, what is this guy? Why do I want him here? And so we see here in verse 14 that Achish said to his servants, look, you see the man is insane. Why have you brought him to me? Have I need of madmen? And so the king looks and he says, this guy is completely out of it. This guy is completely harmless. And so there's really no reason to kill him. There's no reason to wipe him out. And so absolutely incredible as David begins to go through the situation, whether it was during his pretending to be mad or directly after pretending to be mad, that he comes to the point of saying, wow, you know what? I know what I need to do. I'm not going to be afraid of men anymore. I'm not going to be afraid of what man can do to me. And so I'm going to put my faith in God. And so during this passage, directly between chapters 21 and chapters 22, there's another psalm that you should be aware of. In Psalm 34, this beautiful psalm that opens up this, again, with the header, with the preface, says, a psalm of David when he pretended madness before Abimelech, who drove him away, and he departed. At this point, he says, I pretended madness, and Ahimelech sends me away. And as he sends me away, so amazingly that David begins to recognize, what can men do? And as he departs, he says this, Psalm 34, verse 1, I will bless the Lord at all times. His praise shall continually be in my mouth. My soul shall make its boast in the Lord. Absolutely amazing that he makes this statement that, wow, I was completely wrong in what I was doing. I was trying to protect myself. I was trying to do what I could in my own strength and my own wisdom. And so he comes to this point where when he is freed, he realizes it was never me. It was never me. It wasn't what I did. It was what God did. And so beautifully and so understandably, as we see here God in his ministry, that David grasps, God, you did the work. You saved me. You redeemed me. And so he makes that beautiful statement there in verse 3, oh, magnify the Lord with me. Let us exalt his name together. He wants everyone who reads this psalm to know that when he was captured and then he was playing like he was crazy, and that he was then cast away and he departed. He wants everyone to know this wasn't me. God didn't use my wisdom. God didn't use my craziness. God himself was sovereign, and God himself released me. It was God. It wasn't me. It wasn't my idea. It was who God was. And it's important to recognize that. And so as he comes, he says in verse 4, I sought the Lord and he heard me and he delivered me from all my fears. And in verse 8, oh, taste and see that the Lord is good. Blessed is the man who trusts in him. So amazingly that as David comes through this situation, he recognizes, God, this is you. This is your heart. And there's nothing that I can physically do to try to have the victory. There's nothing I can physically do to grasp what's going on, but I do trust you. And so I love the fact that what David does is he, for whatever reason, goes to Gath. For whatever reason, takes the sword of Goliath to Gath. And they recognize him, bring him before the king. But then he's released. And God in his sovereignty frees David, and without any harm, without any issues, other than maybe his pride, but he has no true harm. And so it begins this, as the king simply says in verse 15, have I need of a madman that you've brought this fellow to play the madman in my presence? Shall this fellow come into my house? One of a couple things. Either the king may think, this guy's not David. This isn't the David that I know. This isn't the David that I heard of. This is a guy who, keep in mind that David has been ragged. He's been in the field for 3 days. He's, been crying. He's been weeping there with Jonathan. He goes and he's there before the priest. He's finally has some food to eat. He winds up there in Gath, and why he's trying to hide out in enemy territory is because he doesn't think there's any safe places there in Israel territory. But he's thinking, maybe I can hide here. But he's recognized by the soldiers, or the sword is recognized, and he's brought before the king. The king, for whatever reason, either doesn't believe that this is David, or he doesn't believe that David is going to be any harm to him. So he simply releases him. And as he gets released, David recognizes, God, this is your hand. I see your hand. I know your hand. I confess it's your hand, and I confess it's your goodness, and I'm going to put my trust in you, and I'm not going to fear man. And this is going to be a powerful thing as we get into the next chapter, because immediately into the next chapter, we begin to see something amazing that David, while he's in this fear, is terrified and alone. And in verse 1 of chapter 22, David therefore departed from there and escaped to the cave of Adullam. So when his brothers and his father's house heard it, they went down to him, and everyone who was in distress, everyone who was in debt, everyone who was discontented, gathered to him. So he became captain over them, and there were about 400 men with him. Do you realize that once David put his faith back in the Lord, once he realized that men can't do anything, and he began to walk as the king that God had made him into, not as a fool, not as a jester, but as the king, as he began to walk as that king and put his faith back in God and say, what can men do to me? At that point, we begin to see that God began to surround David with men who needed that assurance of faith, that assurance of God and his power. And so those who were in debt, those who were in distress, those who were discontented, those who weren't happy now were drawn to David. And as they were drawn to David, I do believe they were drawn to God. And so we begin to see that these men who were in debt and in distress and discontented later on become David's mighty men. They become giant slayers, and they become incredible warriors. They follow David. And so rather than playing the madmen and being continued to be lesser men, they now grow from lesser men who are in debt and distress and discontented into mighty warriors. And may that be a lesson to us as trials come and issues begin to face, that we say either we're going to do them ourselves or we're going to trust in God, that God, you're going to be the one to watch over us. What can men do? What can the situation do? I'm not going to look to the situation. I'm going to look to you. I'm going to look to your faithfulness. I'm going to look to your goodness. I'm going to look to your power. And when you do that, when you come back to faith, and all of a sudden, then it's no longer where you're forsaking faith for fear, but it's faith conquering fear, and it's overcoming the fear. And may that be where we are as God's people. Father, we're so grateful for this word and for your heart. We are asking that you would illuminate us to this truth. And Father, when we do have those times of fear, Father, what can situations do to us? What can men do to us? We're not going to fear that. We want to magnify you. We want to magnify your faithfulness. We want to magnify your goodness. So do the work within our hearts as you fill us with your spirit, fill us with your praises, fill us with, Father, the confidence of who you are and how you work. And then when we sink, Lord, when we sink into despair, when we sink into lack of faith, may you be the one to, and say, Lord, just save me. Save me again today. Pull me from this pit. And we recognize that you will lift us up. You'll put us into a place of safety, a place of security with you. We just want to commit these things to you and ask for that work in our hearts. We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.